What's going on, AP European History students? Been a while, but we do have another SIGcast here as we progress towards the final date of May 8th, 2019, the AP exam, unless this is the year after, which we may regurgitate this presentation. But we're going to look today at the culture of Europe and Western civilization after World War I. You know, the war's over, World War I's over, the Russian Revolution has been successful, depending on who you ask, and the world has its first communist nation. Things looked really crazy, obviously during World War I, but also initially after the First World War. Europe, as well as other European nations, sought to reinvent themselves. We had newly formed nations as a result of self-determination in the Treaty of Versailles, places like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, and basically you had old school European nations trying to figure out where they fit in. How were they going to continue on? Nonetheless, no matter how you look at it, the wounds were really, really still deep after the First World War, and Western culture was definitely shell-shocked and forever changed. So this presentation, we don't look at battles, we don't look at treaties. What we're doing is we're talking about culture. What was it like at all levels in and after World War I? So if you remember, pre-World War I, we saw realist artists try to accurately create representations of reality. And then that lasted for a while, but then new art forms began to deviate from this realist philosophy, and those are called avant-garde, all right? And they were new and unusual experimental ideas, especially in the arts, and it had some crazy people or new way of thinking people introducing them, and that's going to challenge realism. We actually started to talk about this prior to World War I, if you remember. There were feelings of uncertainty, chaos. We talked about the irrational, and these feelings manifested themselves in art. Again, art is a reflection of what's going on in society. So after World War I, the traditional views of aesthetics, proper, good looks, middle-class values, were really shattered and sometimes even mocked in favor of the abstract and some chaotic imagery and sound. We'll talk about music in this presentation as well. And we kind of started with this with the Impressionists and Claude Monet in the 1870s and 1880s, trying to portray their sensory impressions in their work. They looked to the world around them for subject matter, and they turned their backs on the traditional themes such as battles, religious scenes, and the wealthy elites. Modern art's goal was to appear irrational and completely subjective. All right, and as modern science and philosophy had really shaken people's faith in the objective truth and rationality, movements such as post-impressionism or expressionism and Dadaism destroyed the traditional ideas of art and form, as images were meant to be confusing and were based, as I said, on subjective interpretation. Expressionists like Van Gogh built on impressionist motifs of color and light, but added a deep psychological element to their pictures. They sought to search within the self and reveal or express deep inner feelings on the canvas. We already covered Cubism, like Picasso, which was a highly analytical approach to art, and it concentrated on a complex geometry of zigzagging lines and sharply angled overlapping planes that exemplified the ongoing trend towards abstract, non-representational art. Now, World War I would further radicalize art away from the traditional. Rather than having a specific meaning, the goal of these art movements was to evoke an emotional response which depended on the perspective of the viewer. So let's kind of take a look here. You've seen this one before. As I said, this is kind of expressionism. Edvard Munch, The Scream. Again, the psychological inner feelings. You kind of see a little bit of the impressionist style in the background, but again, more emotional, psychological theme in terms of the character in The Scream. And the one on the right is a Franz Marc deer in the woods. All right, Franz Marc and a deer in the woods in 1914. Again, a really good example of expressionism. You can kind of see the deer if you look closely. But it's kind of interesting about Franz Mark, after the mobilization of the German army, the government identified notable artists and wanted them withdrawn from combat for their own safety. And this is just kind of a tragic story. Mark was on the list, but before they could move him, before they could get the information that he didn't have to fight and they wanted to protect him, he was struck in the head and killed instantly by a shell splinter during the Battle of Verdun in 1916. So, kind of a tragic end here. This is another Franz Marc, and it's Die groben blauen Pferde, which is probably terrible pronunciation of German, but it translates into the large blue horses. So you have a landscape, again, an expressionist view. And in 1916, a group of artists and intellectuals exiled in Switzerland started a new movement called Dadaism. And it attacked all the familiar standards of art and celebrated the outrageous. You know, the war proved life was meaningless, and Dadaists argued that art should be too. They tried to shock audiences with what they called anti-art. And, you know, this one in particular is by Marcel Duchamp, and the name of the piece is LHOOQ, which is a pun. And it's actually a very vulgar pun, but the letters pronounced in French sound like L should Q, and she is hot in the, I can't even say it, she is hot in the rear, I'll for lack of better terminology, or she has a hot rear. And it's, again, a really vulgar expression implying that a woman has sexual relentlessness. You know, you take it, the fact that it is a Da Vinci, it's Mona Lisa, it's a masterpiece. The dude sketches a vulgar pun on it, and you know, if you can see, he puts a mustache on him and a little goatee, whatever you want to call that. But again, you know, anti-art, taking something that is supposedly beautiful and just kind of making something different out of them. Here's another great example of Dadaism, and this is what's called a ready-made sculpture, produced by Marcel Duchamp in 1917. It's a porcelain urinal, and it's signed R. Mutt. And in 1917, this ordinary piece of plumbing was chosen by Duchamp. It was submitted for an exhibition in the Society of Independent Artists, the inaugural exhibition by the Society to be staged at the Grand Central Palace in New York. His presentation, the urinal's orientation, was altered from its usual positioning. As you can kind of see here, it's upside down. And, you know, the fountain was not rejected by the committee, since society rules stated that all works would be accepted from artists who paid the fee, but the work was never placed in the show area. Following the removal, the fountain was photographed, and the photo was published, and, you know, the original work has been lost. But again, it's an example of, you know, ready-made, just taking, you know, a normal piece of whatever, plumbing, what have you, and kind of making it art. You know, a little bit later on, kind of similar after World War II, like Pittsburgh's own Andy Warhol, you know, taking contemporary pop culture items and turning them into art. Surrealism. But during the 20s, some of the Dadaists were attracted to something called surrealism. Surrealists like Salvador Dali, pictured here, were intrigued by Freudian psychology and portrayed images of the subconscious in their art. They painted fantastic images of wild dreams and uncomfortable symbols where watches melted and large metronomes beat time in precisely drawn but impossible alien landscapes. You know, Salvador Dali is probably the most famous. This is one of his most famous paintings of this particular era, The Persistence of Memory. So, like visual art, composers also began to deviate from traditional form and sound. Dissonance, or lack of harmony, became the dominant and characterization of the 20th century symphonies under composers like Arnold Schoenberg and Igor Stravinsky. Both composers created music that was extremely controversial at the time and created a music that was almost unpleasant or disturbing. Stravinsky's Rite of Spring caused a riot when it was first performed in Paris in 1913. It was a combination of pulsating rhythms and dissonant sounds from the orchestra pit with earthy representations of lovemaking by strangely dressed dancers on the stage. And this shocked audience accustomed to traditional ballet, and people flipped out. This dissonance also was particularly evident in Schoenberg's 12-tone technique that featured music of all 12 notes used evenly. Schoenberg was drafted to serve in the Austrian army at age 42, which interrupted his work and caused him to do little composing during the war. And it wouldn't be till after or later that Schoenberg would be able to introduce his influential 12-tone method of composing. He shunned the long-established musical conventions. Just as abstract painters arranged line and color but did not draw identifiable objects, so did Arnold Schoenberg, who arranged sounds without creating any recognizable harmonies. The musical notes in a given piece were no longer united by an organized key. Instead, they were independent and unrelated. The 12-tone style could be traced and only detected by a highly trained eye or ear studying the musical score. Audiences generally resisted atonal music. It was only till after World War II did it start to gain independence. As a result, music had no clear tone or key, and often sounded like random notes being hit in no particular pattern or order. So again, an example would be Igor Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. I'm going to include, I know some of you guys are into music, I'm going to put 2 YouTube pieces to further your understanding, help further your understanding of post-World War I music to this lesson. So stay tuned for that. And then World War I technology or tech and gender roles. What were we talking about here? You know, on a more positive note, technology began to really accelerate in development heavily after World War I, specifically with radios, telephones, and cars. And we'll see the totalitarian regimes use these for propaganda and manipulating the mass society that had been emerging. So shows, speeches, and announcements could now be heard live, and people could communicate and travel far more easily and quickly. Along with technology, post-World War I views on women became very, very much more progressive. With men at war, women were often left to run the factories and the households, and had proven that, you know, some of the old standard stereotypes that kind of pre-labeled them into the more traditional roles were shattered. So not only did this showcase their ability to act independently and manage their household and their country, it also emboldened women to fight for the rights, especially for suffrage. As you know, in the United States, after World War I, women were rewarded with the right to vote in the 19th Amendment in 1920. As a result, suffrage movements across Europe and the United States resulted in most Western countries actually allowing women to vote in public elections soon after World War I. So women were now part of the political equation. And there you have it, the culture of Europe and Western society and the changes that occurred during and after World War I. Thanks for tuning in.